World War II went so badly for some nations that they sought help from civilians. And I'm not talking about conscription, but what happens after you've conscripted everyone able to fight and you still need more help. The arming of civilians is a radical step for any government to consider, because by their very nature, civilians lack the military skills, discipline and professionalism of trained soldiers, and the effectiveness of a gang of armed civilians against an aggressive enemy army is minimal. The other big problem that it throws up is legal. Simply arming civilians lays such people open to a charge of being saboteurs, spies, or even partisans, categories under the rules of war that have, throughout modern history, attracted violent retribution from conquering armies. Therefore, in World War II, nations forced to arm and deploy civilians tried to make the levies official extensions of the national army, in effect creating militias. The British demonstrated this in 1940, when, following the defeat of her professional army in France and the evacuation of its remains out of Dunkirk, little remained with which to combat a putative German invasion. The government created the local defence volunteers, soon to be renamed the Home Guard. It was organised on army lines, and in lieu of uniform, its members received armbands denoting their combatant status. Later, proper uniforms and weapons were provided, and the Home Guard became a real army, though it was never put to the test in combat. It is important to note, however, that members of the Home Guard were often World War I veterans. They had already had military experience, understood discipline and tactics, and had a familiarity with weapons, as well as often experience of actual combat. In 1944, Germany faced an even more dire set of circumstances than Britain had in 1940. The war was being lost on all fronts, and Germany had thoroughly trawled its available manpower for military service, cancelling many categories of exemptions that had kept men out of combat and in industry, from those with medical conditions to those in reserved occupations. But even though hundreds of thousands of new soldiers, many of doubtful quality, were taken from industry and inducted into the army, it wasn't enough. Another expedient was the re-rolling of Luftwaffe ground crews and Kriegsmarine sailors into infantry units, these two categories no longer requiring the vast numbers of men on their books, as the Air Force had shrunk and most of the Kriegsmarine surface fleet had either been destroyed or was lying redundant in ports. But it still wasn't enough. Lowering the age of recruitment helped drafting in boys of the class of 1927, but more were needed. In fact, by 1944, Germany was producing more weapons than it had soldiers to use. Such were the terrible losses of years of combat, mostly on the Eastern Front. A political solution was sought. Germany had a history of national militias dating from the Napoleonic Wars, and raising a new national militia was first proposed by Colonel General Heinz Guderian, Chief of the General Staff in 1944. Hitler ordered Martin Bormann, his secretary and head of the party chancellery, to recruit 6 million men into this militia, announced to the public on the 16th of October 1944. Though it never achieved 6 million members, the Volkssturm, or People's Storm, would be extensive. From where did its soldiers come from? All men between the ages of 16 and 60 could join, but as the nation had already been thoroughly combed for men for the army, what was left for the Volkssturm? Underage boys and overage men, with a few of military age somehow still exempt from the regular army. Most were middle-aged or elderly, and Germans joked, "Why is the Volkssturm Germany's most precious resource? Because its members have silver in their hair, gold in their mouths, and lead in their bones." This new force wasn't placed under army control, where it might have provided some assistance to the fighting troops, but instead remained under NSDAP control, its regional units under the command of Nazi Party functionaries at Gauleiter and Kreisleiter level. However, once committed to action, Volkssturm units would come under nominal army command in the field, an unsatisfactory situation for the army, always wary of political interference in the running of the war. The Volkssturm was organized thus. Each Gauleiter or Kreisleiter had an officer on his staff in the post of Volkssturm Chief of Staff. The local Volkssturm battalions were organized as follows. Each Kreis, a Nazi political division analogous to the modern American county, had one battalion of Volkssturm. There were 920 Kreiser in wartime Germany. The battalion consisted of a number of companies, each recruited and administered by an Ortsgruppe, a local NSDAP chapter. The companies were subdivided into platoons and the platoons into groups. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and the police, was able to assume much practical control over the Volkssturm, and a jurisdictional battle broke out between Himmler and Bormann, further eroding the effectiveness of the organization. The official uniform of the Volkssturm consisted of an armband. Although individual units were often uniformed in a wide variety of military outfits, including World War II uniforms and also stuff from World War I and from Nazi Party organizations. Field equipment was largely provided by the individual soldier himself, while steel helmets ranged from proper Stahlhelms to Luftschutz, air raid protection headgear, and foreign helmets re-rolled for new service. The rank insignia followed a system of collar diamonds, similar to that of the SS, but with different rank nomenclature. Training was not very extensive. The men received a short course in drill and weapons training, though it must be remembered that the middle-aged members were often World War I veterans, and any training was a refresher to that which they had already received 25 years before in the Emperor's army. Arming the Volkssturm was difficult. There was no uniformity. The World War II Army standard rifle, the Mauser 98K, was in short supply due to the needs of the regular army, but World War I-era Gewehr 98s were plentiful, as well as late 19th century rifles such as the Gewehr 71 and Steyr Mannlicher M1888. One source of weapons were the millions of rifles, machine guns and pistols captured during the many campaigns since 1939, and huge numbers of Soviet, Italian, French, and even British weapons were given to the Volkssturm. But having so many foreign weapons in one army created a logistics nightmare due to different ammunition calibers and the availability of spares. As a way to bridge the gap between Volkssturm weapons requirements and foreign armaments, the Nazi Party attempted to produce a series of cheap and easy-to-make weapons specifically for the militia. This resulted in a series of rifles known as Volkssturmgewehr, but due to various problems, only 10,000 Gustloff Volkssturmgewehrs were actually manufactured. Another was a knockoff British Sten submachine gun called the MP3008, having a vertical magazine instead of a side magazine in the British model. Only about 10,000 of these were manufactured before war's end. Most Volkssturm had to make do with old German weapons or foreign rifles and machine guns with limited ammunition supplies. As Germany's enemies approached the borders of the Reich in early 1945, they began to encounter Volkssturm units in addition to the usual Wehrmacht formations. In the West, there was less will generally to oppose the Anglo-American armies, particularly among civilian militias. Though fighting between regular German forces and Allied troops was often fierce and desperate, the Volkssturm largely surrendered to avoid having their towns leveled by US or British artillery fire. The few who tried to fight only succeeded in getting themselves killed and ruining their towns and villages. In the East, things were quite different. Soviet atrocities against German civilians were widely reported in the German press and used by Dr. Goebbels' propaganda ministry to stiffen the German resolve to fight on to the bitter end.
In der vorgeschobenen Stellung einer Sturmgeschützabteilung.
Volkssturm units proved remarkably useful, particularly in the horrendous close-quarter street fighting in the Battle of Berlin. The Volkssturm had been issued one very useful weapon in lieu of having any artillery or mortars of its own, the Panzerfaust. There was no shortage of these one-shot anti-tank shape-charge weapons, and they proved lethal against Soviet tanks, particularly in urban combat. Hundreds of Soviet tanks fell to Panzerfausts, many in the hands of Volkssturm militiamen. Many Volkssturm units simply fell to bits in combat due to inexperience, poor quality troops, or indifferent leadership, but if properly led and motivated, Volkssturm battalions could be fearsome opponents. The classic example is 3rd 115th Siemensstadt Battalion in Berlin. It comprised 770 World War I veterans in their 50s, all of whom were factory workers at Siemens, led by World War I-era officers. Organized correctly, it had 3 rifle companies with French rifles and MG-42 machine guns, a support company armed with 2 infantry support guns, 4 mortars and heavy machine guns, and a heavy weapons company with 4 captured Soviet M20 howitzers and a French Debange 220mm mortar. On the 22nd of April, the battalion position was assaulted by Red Army forces. The battalion had been preparing positions for 2 months just north of Mühlsdorf S-Bahn stations in Berlin. Their left flank was held by an army battalion and the right by the Warnholz police battalion. The Volkssturm battalion counterattacked the Soviets, buying time for them to pull back to new positions at Friedrichsfelde Ost S-Bahn station. But Soviet pressure built up again, and by midnight the battalion had withdrawn. By the 2nd of May, when Berlin fell, the battalion had been reduced from 770 men to only 50 riflemen and 2 machine guns. 26 men of this battalion received the Iron Cross. 4 Volkssturm members received the Knight's Cross, Germany's premier award for gallantry, a notable recipient being Battalion Commander Ernst Tiburzi, who commanded his unit in the defense of Königsberg. He personally knocked out 5 Soviet T-34s during the battle using the ubiquitous Panzerfaust. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.